The year was 1945, and the world was held in a silent, agonizing breath. We had fought, oh how we had fought, from the black oil slicks of Pearl Harbor to the sun-scorched dunes of North Africa, from the frozen, blood-stained forests of the Ardennes to the desolate, impossible islands of the Pacific. Our hands were on the levers of history, and our collective will had bent the iron arc of destiny. Victory, the brilliant, blinding prize we had sacrificed so much for, was finally within sight, close enough that we could smell the smoke of the enemy's final, desperate fires. Yet a shadow remained, and it was the darkest shadow of all: the last mile. This final approach, this terrible, fragile endgame, was the most treacherous time of the entire conflict. The enemy, though broken, was not yet beaten. Wounded animals are the most dangerous, and we knew that their final acts could be ones of catastrophic, vengeful nihilism. A leak, a whisper, a false move, any revelation that the Allies were drawing the final maps of surrender could unleash a hell of scorched earth, chemical retaliation, and mass sabotage aimed not at winning, but simply at guaranteeing our maximum suffering. The promise of peace, if it arrived too soon or too loudly, could be the trigger for an even greater calamity. It was a weight too heavy for any single man. Yet three men, our President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his counterparts Churchill and Stalin, had to bear it in absolute, profound silence for us. We, the citizens, the soldiers, the shipbuilders, the riveters, were holding the line, believing in the necessary ongoing fight, utterly unaware that the true, final battle was being fought in the secret, smoke-filled rooms of a distant, devastated palace. It was there, cloaked in the darkest gray of wartime secrecy, that the architects of our peace, the peace we had earned with every sacrifice, met to draw the borders of tomorrow. The war was still raging, but for those few frozen, tense days, the future of the world was a whispered negotiation, a terrifying, hopeful secret held tight to the chest of this great nation. We had poured every ounce of our ingenuity, our industrial might, and our moral fortitude into defeating the Axis. Our mothers worked the factory lines. Our farmers maximized the yield. Our children collected scrap metal. We understood the price of freedom in the currency of blood and toil. But Roosevelt, seeing the ledger of sacrifice, knew that winning the war was only half the equation. The other half was ensuring that we would never have to fight this war again, that the triumph would be lasting, glorious, and structured. The enemy's desperation was palpable. Intelligence reports spoke of plots to assassinate leaders, hidden caches of devastating new weapons, and plans for a systematic destruction of European infrastructure, designed to leave us nothing but ashes to inherit. If the Axis powers were to learn that the post-war world had already been divided, that the creation of a global security council, the United Nations, was already a near certainty, it could have provoked the very worst kind of retaliatory chaos. It would have been a final, devastating act of spite, dragging the conflict out for months, costing perhaps hundreds of thousands more of our precious lives. The secrecy, therefore, was not merely diplomatic caution. It was a profound act of protection for every single American soldier still on the front lines, and for every family waiting fearfully back home. The decision to negotiate the peace while the guns were still firing required a moral and strategic nerve that few leaders in history have ever possessed. President Roosevelt carried the crushing weight of this contradiction. To the American people, he was the steady hand, the voice on the radio assuring us that we would persevere, that the fight was hard but righteous. Yet secretly, he was already dealing in futures, in spheres of influence, in international law, and in the delicate political balance that would define the next century. This dual reality, the public commitment to war, the private preparation for peace, defined the final chapter of his life, and, by extension, the final chapter of our collective wartime experience. The preparations for the Yalta Conference were a marvel of wartime operational security. The journey itself was a metaphor for the weight of the mission. Our president, increasingly frail but with a will of iron that defied his physical body, was transported halfway across a world still actively at war. The security apparatus around him was unmatched. Every ship, every plane, every sailor, and every coded message was a thread in the cloak of invisibility that we wove around this vital meeting. We didn't know where he was going or exactly what he was doing, but we trusted him. That trust, that blind faith in the leadership of this great nation, was a critical component of the secrecy. If we, the people, had shown division or doubt, the mission would have failed before it began. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin vanished into the cold, historical landscape of the Crimea. They met in the Livadia Palace, a grand building that bore the scars of the conflict, a perpetual reminder of the devastation we were there to end. The atmosphere must have been almost unbearable. The polite smiles masking tectonic political disagreements, the necessity of alliance rubbing against the reality of diverging post-war visions. They were surrounded by maps, not maps of current battles, but maps of the future. The sheer magnitude of the decisions made there, the fate of entire nations, the drawing of lines that would endure for generations, was almost too vast to comprehend. The suspension of the public truth was the masterstroke. We continued to read headlines of slow, grinding victories, of necessary, painful pushes across the Rhine and through the islands. We continued to ration, to mourn, and to work. All the while, the three leaders were already moving on to the next phase, the ultimate objective, establishing a global structure that would protect our children from enduring such horror again. This was the quiet, glorious act of foresight, the ultimate act of resilience that defined American leadership in that era. Imagine the scene. It was a cold, brutal February. The air inside the palace must have crackled with tension. These were the men who held the destiny of the planet in their hands, negotiating over tables cluttered with maps and documents detailing not military movements, but civilian populations, industrial zones, and ideological fault lines. The enemy was still capable of listening, of intercepting, of assassination. The silence around the purpose of the meeting was the only shield we had. The discussions at Yalta were threefold, and each part was essential to securing our future and avoiding the final, devastating sabotage the Axis could still attempt. Publicly, the talks were about coordinating the final, simultaneous assaults on both the German and Japanese fronts. This was the necessary cover story, the narrative that kept the enemy guessing and focused on the immediate tactical threats. We needed to convince them that the only thing on the table was more war, more tanks, and more relentless pressure. Every statement given to the press, every carefully curated photo opportunity was designed to reinforce this image of an implacable, war-focused alliance. This part of the negotiation was the key to preventing immediate, large-scale counterattacks. By maintaining the appearance of a strictly military conference, We ensured that the remnants of the Axis High Command continued to deploy their limited resources in predictable military fashion, rather than dissolving into guerrilla resistance or deploying weapons of last resort in an attempt to scuttle the peace talks.
Yet the true, hidden work, the work done in the deepest hours and behind closed doors, was the architecture of peace. This was where the promise of a global security body, the United Nations, was hammered out. This was not a theoretical exercise. It was a direct response to the devastation we had just endured. A commitment that future disputes would be settled by dialogue, not by blood. Roosevelt, in particular, was driven by the knowledge that the sacrifices made by our young men and women would be meaningless if the ensuing peace was not structurally sound. We had given everything, and the president was determined to build a lasting edifice worthy of that sacrifice. The negotiations over the Security Council, the veto power, and the initial membership were the very definition of resilience. The ability to look at total ruin and begin immediately to construct a global system of self-repair. This part of the secret was the most dangerous to reveal. If the enemy learned that the Allied leaders were already dividing their land, establishing new governments, and planning a post-war economic order, they could have unleashed a wave of terror and destruction. We faced the threat of systematic infrastructure destruction, where, knowing they had lost, the enemy could have implemented a total, devastating plan to destroy every bridge, every factory, and every cultural landmark across Europe, leaving us to face a catastrophic humanitarian disaster and a decades-long reconstruction effort. We also risked unrestricted warfare, where they might have abandoned all remaining conventions, resorting to chemical warfare or deploying any experimental horrific technology they possessed simply to extract maximum vengeance before the inevitable end. Finally, the possibility of widespread sabotage loomed, where the knowledge of imminent surrender could have driven fanatic elements to infiltrate liberated or soon-to-be liberated zones, carrying out targeted assassinations, bombings, and acts of social disruption, turning the moment of liberation into a bloodbath. The secrecy wasn't about hiding a military advantage. It was denying the enemy a psychological trigger, the signal that would drive them to the ultimate, spiteful, suicidal acts of mass destruction. It was an act of profound strategic empathy for the civilian populations and the Allied troops who would bear the brunt of any final, unnecessary escalation. We, the people, were being shielded by this cloak of silence. The most politically sensitive negotiations concerned the occupation and denazification of Germany and the balance of power in Eastern Europe. We, as Americans, entered those talks with an unshakable belief in democracy and self-determination. The political haggling, the long, grueling nights of debate, these were the true, silent acts of war. Every inch of territory, every promise of free elections, every demand for democratic governance was fought for on our behalf. Roosevelt was not just representing the United States, he was representing the ideals for which we had fought. He was the champion of the four freedoms, arguing for a world where nations could choose their own path. The compromises made were painful, necessitated by the reality of military positions and the shared burden of victory. But the core promise remained. We would not just defeat tyranny, we would plant the seeds of enduring freedom in its place. The pressure was immense. Outside the window, the war ground on. Inside, the three leaders were making decisions that would affect the lives of hundreds of millions. Our president, worn down by service and disease, pushed forward driven by the knowledge that he was negotiating the debt we owed to the fallen. He was ensuring that their deaths meant something lasting, something structural. When the meetings concluded and the final, secret documents were signed, the return journey must have been the most psychologically demanding phase of all. The President, the Secretary of State, and the entire high-level delegation were returning to a world still mired in the daily brutality of combat. They held the knowledge of peace, the certainty of the enemy's inevitable end, and the blueprint for the post-war world, while simultaneously being required to maintain the public facade of a war still being fought on all terms. They carried the future in their briefcases, but they couldn't speak of it.
Imagine the restraint, the discipline required to hold that monumental secret. We, back home, were still biting our nails over casualty reports. Our soldiers were still slugging it out in the hedgerows. And the leaders, knowing the end was assured, had to urge the continued, relentless punishing pressure of war. This was the ultimate act of leadership, an act of pure, selfless strategic genius on behalf of this great nation. They were holding back the news for one reason: to guarantee the safest possible arrival of the peace we had earned. Announcing the peace treaty too early would have been a catastrophic blunder, equivalent to opening the floodgates to chaos. The silence was the safety valve. Let us consider the alternative, the horror we averted through the secrecy. For instance, German intelligence had plans for the werewolf operation, a desperate, fanatic resistance movement designed to continue fighting long after the official surrender. If the surrender terms had been prematurely broadcast, the Nazis would have immediately launched this operation, turning every village in Germany into a death trap for our liberating troops and extending the bloody conflict into a brutal civilian-driven counterinsurgency campaign. The secret plan allowed Allied military forces to continue their final coordinated push, overwhelming the enemy before the fanatic elements could be fully mobilized and organized. Furthermore, in the Pacific, the conflict was reaching a pitch fever. The negotiations at Yalta included commitments regarding Soviet involvement against Japan, a critical piece of the endgame puzzle. Prematurely announcing the post-war settlements in Europe could have led Japan to redouble its defense, believing the Allies were internally divided or distracted. The disciplined secrecy maintained the illusion of an unwavering focus, accelerating the strategic conclusion in the Pacific theater, and ultimately saving our forces from the horrific costs of a full-scale invasion. Roosevelt knew that we had given enough. He wanted to minimize the final casualty count, and the only way to do that was to maintain the highest level of strategic ambiguity, allowing our armies to secure all objectives before the news of the post-war plan could be used by the enemy as a final, desperate rallying cry. Then came the spring, and then came the moment when the silence was finally broken. The victory, VE Day, arrived not as a shot, but as the inevitable, glorious culmination of all the sacrifices, the strategy, and the profound secrecy of the final weeks. We poured into the streets, weeping with relief, the weight of years lifting off our national soul. The cheers and the celebrations were for the soldiers and the sailors, for the factory workers and for the farmers, for us, the people who had borne the brunt. But underneath the visible triumph was the silent, architectural victory achieved at Yalta. The peace we celebrated was not just a ceasefire, it was a structure built in secret, designed to hold. When we look at the legacy of that meeting, we must view it through the lens of that necessary secrecy. We did not just win a war, we built the peace. We built the United Nations, the institution that, for all its flaws, has served as a global debating floor, preventing the localized conflict from spiraling into total world war for over 70 years.
This was the ultimate expression of our collective resilience to move immediately from killing to conciliation. We rebuilt the world. The post-war economic order, the Marshall Plan, the entire concept of international cooperation. These were the necessary consequences of the maps drawn in the cold Russian palace. We committed to not just winning, but restoring. The ultimate triumph was the collective spirit that allowed this all to happen. The spirit of trust that enabled Roosevelt to negotiate without fear of public dissent or immediate scrutiny. The spirit of sacrifice that kept our troops fighting even as their leaders were planning the peace. And the spirit of awe that remains when we reflect on what was accomplished. It is a stunning, glorious realization. In those frozen, silent days, when the world believed the battle was still everything, our leaders were quietly, brilliantly, and under the cover of immense secrecy, laying the foundation for the next 7 decades of global order. They took the victory we had fought for, wrapped it in a security blanket of silence, and delivered it safely to us, thus preventing the final, most terrible act of sabotage. The feeling that washes over us now, looking back, is one of profound, lasting inspiration. This is what this great nation is capable of, not just the thunder of war,
but the quiet, strategic brilliance of the peace. We look upon that pivotal moment, that secret meeting, and we are reminded that true resilience is not just surviving the storm, but planning the structure of the harbor while the winds still rage. And that, dear friends, is a story of our strength, and it is a triumph that will endure for all time. The complexity of the Yalta Conference and the intense secrecy surrounding its outcomes highlight a profound truth about American leadership and the collective burden we undertook: that the work of peace is often more demanding and more clandestine than the violence of war. We, the public, saw the surface: the photographs of the three great leaders, the diplomatic pronouncements about the final crushing of the Axis. But the deeper, hidden reality was a race against time and terror, where a single intelligence leak could have negated our greatest efforts and plunged the world into an extended, vengeful phase of the conflict. The stakes were not abstract. The Nazi leadership, already descending into a bunker mentality, possessed the will to inflict unimaginable destruction. They held the remnants of their industrial machine, their most fanatical devotees, and the capability for biological and chemical retribution. Their primary goal, once defeat was inevitable, was not to win, but to make us pay the highest price possible for our victory. Had they intercepted detailed reports of the Yalta Accords, the division of Germany, the planned trials, the commitment to an immediate post-war occupation, it would have signaled the moment of last resort, triggering preemptive, systemic destruction across the continent. The secrecy, therefore, was a massive global triage effort, ensuring that the infrastructure and the civilian populations of Europe survived the final death throes of the Third Reich. Our decision-makers were literally buying time for the world to be saved from its own ruins. This strategy required a singular focus and a terrifying self-control from President Roosevelt. He was not merely negotiating with Stalin and Churchill, he was negotiating with the clock, the enemy's desperation, and his own failing health. Every compromise made, every hard-won agreement on post-war borders or political influence was weighed against the potential cost in American lives if the war were to drag on unnecessarily. We, the people back home, felt the tension, but they bore the knowledge, the terrible, magnificent knowledge that the war was, in truth, already decided, and that the only remaining variable was the body count. The creation of the United Nations, a cornerstone of the Yalta Agreements, stands as a testament to our foresight and our refusal to repeat the mistakes of the past. We learned that a military victory is insufficient without a parallel diplomatic structure to sustain it. The League of Nations failed because it lacked teeth and commitment. The United Nations, conceived in the very shadow of the war's worst moments, was designed to be robust, to be universal, and to be the ultimate expression of our shared global responsibility. It was a promise made to the next generation, a collective oath sworn over the fresh graves of our heroes. We will talk before we fight. The quiet resolve shown by Roosevelt in that frozen palace transcended mere statesmanship. It was a reflection of the deep-seated resilience we all possessed. We had fought against the overwhelming darkness of tyranny. Now, our leaders were ensuring that the hard-won light of peace would not be snatched away by a final act of vengeful darkness. The secrecy of Yalta was the final, most brilliant defense of the American dream, a collective triumph of strategy, sacrifice, and the unwavering belief that this great nation would not only defeat its enemies, but would lead the world into a new era of possibility. And for that, we remain in awe. To fully grasp the magnitude of the secrecy, we must appreciate the geopolitical chess match Roosevelt was playing. He was dealing with two different enemies simultaneously: the immediate military enemy, the Axis, and the ideological, long-term rival, Stalin. The dual nature of the threat compounded the need for an impenetrable veil of silence over the peace negotiations. The enemy intelligence apparatus, though wounded, was still functioning. It was focused, desperately, on finding cracks in the Allied unity. The appearance of three leaders meeting in secret was in itself a trigger. The official line, that they were coordinating the final military thrusts, was plausible. But any leak suggesting they were discussing things like the Soviet entry into the war against Japan, a massive strategic shift, or, critically, The creation of a permanent global body that would govern the post-war world would have been immediately exploited. Roosevelt's high-stakes gamble. Our president knew that if the details of the post-war partitioning, the agreements on free elections in Eastern Europe, the future of Poland, the division of Germany, were leaked, Stalin could have immediately manipulated the information. The Soviets, knowing the peace was guaranteed, could have halted their offensive, repositioned their forces, or unilaterally seized more territory, complicating the final months of the war for our Western allies and costing us significant strategic advantage. By maintaining strict operational secrecy around the post-war agenda, Roosevelt ensured two vital things for us: military cohesion, where he kept the Soviet military committed to the immediate goal of crushing the German army, preventing any sudden, unilateral political maneuvering that would compromise the final synchronized offensive that we needed to win, and moral leverage, where he retained the moral and diplomatic high ground, allowing us to dictate the terms of the new global order, like the UN Charter, before the political jockeying of the Cold War truly began. The pressure cooker environment demanded that we look beyond the immediate fight. It was a painful transition for the public, who were still mentally locked in the daily struggle. But our leadership had to operate in a future tense, drawing the blueprints for the world we would inhabit. The suspense of those days was not just whether the war would end, but whether the peace would be salvageable from the ruins. The final silent decision to keep the details of Yalta cloaked ensured that when the inevitable surrender came, it came cleanly, militarily, and without the catastrophic, desperate political fallout the enemy was hoping to incite. It was a masterclass in strategic patience and collective determination, a profound achievement of this great nation and the people who stood behind its leaders. The greatest act of faith during this period of secrecy was performed by us, the American people. We trusted. We kept working. We kept fighting.
We accepted the continued need for sacrifice, believing in the steady hand of our president. This was a unique moment of national cohesion, a collective voice, silent and resolute, that echoed the strategic silence of Yalta. Every mother who sent a letter to the front, every worker who clocked a double shift at the defense plant was, in their own way, contributing to the ultimate necessary deception. Our continued dedication to the war effort, even as the end was nearing, was the most convincing evidence to the enemy that the Allies were utterly focused on total, brutal military victory. Our home front effort was the public cover that allowed the private negotiation of peace to proceed without interference. The secrecy protected the promise of the future. The peace agreements forged in those tense, quiet rooms were the legal and moral scaffolding for the world we wanted to build. The commitment to human rights, the promise of economic recovery, the push for decolonization, these were the ideals we believed in, and they were inscribed into the foundations of the post-war structure. The weight of history rests upon those who acted in the shadows. Roosevelt, exhausted and near his end, made the ultimate sacrifice, pushing himself to secure our future even as his own time was running out. He endured the grueling travel, the political infighting, and the profound moral pressure of planning a peace that he would, tragically, not live to see fully realized. His presence at Yalta was his final, most critical campaign, fought not with tanks and planes, but with diplomacy and sheer force of will. When we reflect on Yalta, we must feel a sense of profound awe for the resilience demonstrated. We did not just stumble into peace, we planned it, architected it, and protected its fragile birth with an impenetrable cloak of silence. This collective endeavor, from the soldier in the field to the president in the palace, was the moment this great nation transitioned from a continent of isolation to the global leader of freedom and security. The memory of the secrecy is a permanent reminder that the greatest acts of national greatness are often those performed without fanfare, hidden from the public eye, yet utterly vital to securing the liberty and opportunity we enjoy today. It was a glorious, necessary, and deeply inspiring triumph of foresight over fear. The true measure of Yalta's secrecy lies in what did not happen.
We avoided the catastrophic final wave of enemy sabotage. We prevented the dissolution of the Allied command into political squabbles before the final victory was secured. We ensured that the transition from war to peace, though messy and politically fraught, was structurally sound and internationally ratified. The planning for the United Nations, born in those secret talks, was the ultimate expression of our national character, always seeking a path to a better, more ordered world. It was an acknowledgement that the American victory was too vast, too consequential to be limited to a single nation's benefit. We won the war for the world, and we insisted on helping build the peace for the world. The burden of that knowledge, carried in silence by our president and his delegation, stands as one of the most compelling dramas of the 20th century. It was the moment we learned that the most difficult negotiations are often those conducted not with the enemy, but with our allies and with the terrifying possibilities of the future. The price of that secrecy was high, the psychological strain, the necessary political compromises, but the reward was priceless, the preservation of global infrastructure and the immediate establishment of a framework for international law. This narrative of silent strategic triumph should resonate deeply within us. It is a story of how a democracy, when facing an existential threat, can execute acts of high-level, necessary deception in the service of its highest ideals. It is the story of how our collective will, focused through the visionary leadership of Roosevelt, built a lasting legacy that stretches from the ruins of 1945 to the relative stability of today. We are truly a nation of resilience, capable of enduring the longest night, and even as the darkness presses in, quietly drawing the bright, bold lines of the coming dawn. The Yalta Conference, wrapped in the cloak of the war's final deadly secrecy, was the ultimate manifestation of our American spirit. It was a story of planning and protecting, of fighting in the dark so that the world could awaken in the light. When the history books speak of 1945, they often focus on the tanks rolling into Berlin or the surrender signatures. But the true historians among us, the storytellers who look for the deeper current of national resilience, know that the most critical act took place weeks before in a cold palace beneath a heavy blanket of secrecy. It was there that we won the peace, secured the future, and affirmed our place as the architect of the modern world. The final triumph was not just military, it was moral and strategic. It was the glorious, dramatic, and deeply inspiring moment when this great nation, weary from war, refused to allow the enemy a final spiteful act of global sabotage. We secured the prize we had fought for, and we did so with intelligence, courage, and a commitment to secrecy that saved countless lives and guaranteed the structural integrity of the peace. We look back at those days with awe, a testament to the strength and resolve that resides not just in our leaders, but in us, the people. We are the inheritors of that silent triumph, and our resilience is the legacy of that secret peace.